January 9, 1942. 6:15 a.m. Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. A 37mm shell traveling 2,600 feet per second punched clean through the front armor of a Japanese Type 97 Chiha tank, tore through the crew compartment, killed everyone inside, and exited out the rear before burying itself in the jungle beyond. The tank rolled forward 20 yards on pure momentum. Then it stopped. Then it burned. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Morett watched through his vision block and said one word: weak. He was 26 years old. He had never fought a tank battle before in his life, and in the next 17 minutes, he was about to destroy 8 Japanese tanks that his entire army had been running from for 3 weeks straight. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss videos like this one. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Every single subscriber helps us keep these forgotten stories alive, and trust me, what comes next in this series will blow your mind. 8 tanks, 17 minutes, 0 American losses, against an enemy that his own commanders had declared untouchable. But here's what makes this story insane. The Japanese tanks he destroyed weren't actually superior. They never were. The entire American retreat, 3 weeks of running, 3 weeks of infantry dying without armored support, 3 weeks of psychological collapse, was built on a lie. A rumor. An intelligence assessment made by men who had never actually tested what they were assessing. And it took one staff sergeant, a farm kid turned tanker from Ohio, with exactly 0 tank versus tank experience, to call the bluff that everyone else was too afraid to call. This is the story of how Benjamin Morett destroyed the most dangerous weapon in the Pacific War. Not the Chiha tank. Not Japanese steel or Japanese guns. The weapon he destroyed was fear itself. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army had been at war for 4 years. 4 years of crushing Chinese forces across Manchuria. 4 years of rolling through Southeast Asia. 4 years of building a reputation so terrifying that soldiers who had never faced Japanese armor in combat were already retreating from it in their minds before the first shot was ever fired. The Japanese war machine had done something extraordinarily effective. It had weaponized its own reputation. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines on December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, American and Filipino defenders found themselves immediately on the back foot. General Douglas MacArthur's defensive strategy began collapsing almost immediately under the weight of coordinated Japanese amphibious landings across multiple points on Luzon. The defensive lines that American war planners had spent years designing on paper crumbled within days of actual contact. American forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, a jungle-covered finger of land jutting south into Manila Bay, and began constructing what they hoped would be a defensible perimeter. The plan was simple: hold Bataan, wait for reinforcements from the United States, survive until the Pacific Fleet could break the Japanese naval blockade and resupply the garrison. Boom! What the men on Bataan didn't know, what their commanders were desperately trying to hide from them, was that no reinforcements were coming. The Pacific Fleet lay burning at Pearl Harbor. The strategic priority had shifted to Europe. The Philippines was being written off at the highest levels of American government, even as the men on Bataan were being told to hold on just a little longer. Into this disaster walked the 192nd Tank Battalion. American armor. M3 Stuart light tanks. 26,000 pounds of steel, a 37mm gun, and crews who had trained for months at Fort Knox, believing they were going to be part of the offensive punch that would defend the Philippines. Instead, they received orders that made no tactical sense and that were killing infantry by the hundreds. Preserve the tanks. Avoid engagement. Withdraw when outnumbered. The doctrine had a logic behind it, or at least it seemed logical to the officers who wrote it. American armor was irreplaceable in the Philippines. There were no new tanks coming. Every Stuart that was destroyed was gone forever, And the Japanese had more tanks and more supplies and more everything streaming into the Philippines every day. The mathematically correct decision, the cold strategic calculation, was to keep the tanks alive for the battles that would matter most. And the problem with this logic was that it was killing the war. Japanese infantry advanced. American infantry held or retreated. When they retreated, they called for tank support. The tanks didn't come. More American and Filipino soldiers died. More ground was lost. More retreat. More requests for armor. More denial. By early January 1942, Japanese forces had pushed the Bataan defensive line back so severely that American commanders were drawing new maps every day, because the old ones were already obsolete. Infantry battalions that had gone into the line at full strength were down to 60-50, sometimes 30% of their original numbers. Men were dying from Japanese bullets and Japanese artillery and Japanese air attacks, and the tanks that were supposed to support them sat in covered positions, waiting for an ideal engagement that their commanders kept insisting would come. And threading through all of this poisoning, every tactical decision was the reputation. Japanese tanks were battle-hardened killers. The Chiha had rolled over Chinese armies that couldn't stop it. Japanese armor had cut through British defenses in Malaya in 3 weeks flat. The intelligence briefings that American officers received before the Philippines deployment had characterized Japanese armor as heavily armored, battle-tested, and superior to most Allied designs in the Pacific theater. And there was just one devastating problem with this intelligence picture. Nobody had actually tested it. The first encounter between American and Japanese tanks had happened on December 22, 1941, near the town of Morett on the Lingayen Gulf. A single M3 Stuart from Company B of the 192nd Tank Battalion had spotted 3 Japanese Chiha tanks advancing down a coastal road. The American tank had the advantage: clear fields of fire, element of surprise, effective range. Every tactical condition favored the Americans. The American tank commander had watched the Japanese tanks approach to within 300 yards. Then he reversed out of his position and retreated to American lines without firing a single shot. He reported contact with superior Japanese armor. His commanders accepted the assessment. The intelligence picture was confirmed. Japanese tanks were to be avoided. Preservation doctrine was validated. The 3 Japanese tank commanders who had watched the American withdrawal reported to their superiors that American tanks were unwilling to fight. Japanese intelligence confirmed what it had already suspected. American armor in the Philippines presented a negligible threat. The path forward was clear. M3 weeks. 3 weeks of the same pattern. Japanese tanks advance, American tanks withdraw. Nobody fires, nobody tests. The myth grows stronger every day because nobody is willing to challenge it. Benjamin Morett grew up in Ohio during the Depression. His father worked in manufacturing, and Morett spent his teenage years understanding machines the way some boys understood baseball statistics. Intuitively, completely, with a kind of quiet confidence that came from actually taking things apart and putting them back together rather than just reading about them. He wasn't brilliant in the academic sense. He wasn't a prodigy. He was thorough, patient. He thought about problems until he understood them, not until he had an answer that sounded good. He enlisted before Pearl Harbor, drawn to armor because tanks were machines, and machines made sense to him in a way that a lot of the Army didn't. He trained at Fort Knox, absorbed everything his instructors taught about the M3 Stuart systems, its mechanical strengths and limitations, the ballistics of its 37mm gun. He became a staff sergeant because he was the kind of man who other men naturally followed, not because he was louder or more aggressive than the people around him, but because when Morett said something, he had already thought it through. He arrived in the Philippines in late 1941 as a platoon sergeant commanding 3 M3 Stuarts and 12 men. He went into the Bataan defensive lines with all of the briefings still fresh in his mind. Japanese tanks superior, preserve the armor, withdraw when outnumbered. He followed the doctrine because that was what soldiers did, and because he hadn't yet had a reason to question it. The reason arrived slowly accumulated over 3 weeks of watching men die. Every time Morett's tanks were pulled back from a position where infantry was screaming for support, he watched soldiers fight without armor protection. Watched them try to stop Japanese infantry assaults with rifles and machine guns, while his Stuarts sat covered in jungle camouflage a quarter-mile behind the line. He started doing math in his head. The Stuart's 37mm gun could penetrate 61mm of armor at 100 yards. 61mm. The intelligence briefings on the Chiha had never specified an actual armor thickness. They had used words like heavily armored and battle-tested, but never given a number he could calculate against. Heavily armored meant nothing. It was a description without a dimension, and Morett had been around machines long enough to know that descriptions without dimensions were just opinions. The question that started forming in his mind was simple and dangerous. What if the opinion was wrong? January 9th, 1942. Morett's platoon was positioned in a defensive hold along a jungle trail on the Bataan Peninsula. His 3 Stuarts sat hull down behind a slight rise that provided cover for the lower portions of the tanks, while allowing clear fields of fire across 600 yards of open trail. At 0600 American infantry positions ahead reported Japanese armor moving toward the American lines. At 6:15 Type 97, Chiha tanks appeared at the far end of the trail, advancing in column formation at approximately 15 miles per hour. The Japanese column showed no indication that it knew American armor was waiting. No tactical dispersal. No reconnaissance elements forward. Column formation on a jungle trail moving with the confidence of a force that fully expected the Americans to run. Morett's radio crackled with transmissions from his other 2 tank commanders, both asking the same question. Do we engage or do we pull back? Doctrine was unambiguous. 8 enemy tanks against 3 American tanks. Withdraw. Report the contact. Preserve the armor. Every calculation in the Army's tactical manual pointed toward the same conclusion. Morett looked at the column. He looked at the approaching tanks. He thought about 3 weeks of infantry dying while the Stuarts sat in covered positions. He thought about the math he had been doing in his head for days. 61mm of penetration against armor that nobody had ever actually measured on a battlefield. He keyed his radio. We're going to find out what these guns can do. We're going to. Corporal James Mitchell, 22 years old. Morett's gunner centered the lead Chiha in his sight. 600 yards. The target was approaching. Mitchell's hands rested on the traversing controls. Morett gave the fire command. The 37mm cracked. The round crossed 600 yards in just over a second. It did not ricochet. It did not deflect. It did not fail to penetrate. The armor-piercing shell punched straight through the Chiha's front hull, continued through the fighting compartment, killed the crew, punched through the rear armor, and buried itself in the jungle beyond. For 2 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then flames erupted from the commander's hatch as the ammunition inside began cooking off. The tank rolled forward 20 yards and stopped. Weak. And Mitchell reloaded. The second Chiha took a round through the turret at 550 yards. The third tank was hit by Morett's second Stuart at 500 yards. Japanese tanks began attempting to deploy from column into line formation standard doctrine for an ambush, but the jungle terrain eliminated their maneuver space, and the Americans were already firing. The Japanese returned to fire. Their 57mm guns launched shells that struck short. Struck trees detonated in the earth 15 yards from American positions. Every round failed to penetrate Stuart armor. Not because the Americans were lucky. Because the Stuart's frontal armor measured 51mm at its thickest points, more than twice the penetrating capability of the Japanese gun at any practical combat distance. The fourth Chiha burned at 450 yards. The fifth took a round as it attempted to reverse away from the kill zone. The third Stuart, positioned on a flank, engaged the Japanese column from the side, where 20mm of side armor provided even less protection than the front, and destroyed 2 Chihas in rapid succession. One Japanese commander drove his tank directly at Morett's position. apparently deciding that closing to point-blank range was the only chance his 57mm gun had. The Chiha accelerated from 400 yards to 300 to 200 to 100. At 100 yards, Morett could see the rising sun painted on the turret. He could see the commander's head in the open hatch. Fire. The 37mm at 100 yards didn't just penetrate the Chiha. It went through the front armor, destroyed everything inside, punched through the rear armor, and continued another 100 yards into the jungle beyond. The dead tank rolled forward on momentum and stopped 10 yards from Morett's Stuart. He could see the entry hole in the front armor and the exit hole in the rear, a 3-inch circle straight through a tank that his entire army had been running from for 21 consecutive days. The 8th Chiha fled. The flanking Stuart caught it at 600 yards through the rear armor. It burned like the others. Morett checked his watch. 0633. 18 minutes. 8 Japanese tanks destroyed. 0 American tanks damaged. 0 American casualties. When Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Miller arrived by jeep at 7:15 and surveyed 8 burning wrecks spread across 200 yards of jungle trail, he asked Morett to explain what had happened. Morett walked him to the nearest destroyed Chiha, showed him the entry hole in the front armor, showed him the exit hole in the rear. Miller pulled out a measuring tape from his map case and measured the armor himself. 25mm. The thickest point on the Japanese tank. Less than half what American intelligence had estimated. Against a gun that could penetrate 61mm. Miller asked why Morett had chosen to engage when doctrine required withdrawal. The tanks weren't serving any purpose sitting in reserve while infantry died. Someone needed to find out if Japanese armor was actually as dangerous as everyone believed. The only way to get accurate information was to fight. Miller listened. Then he issued new orders on the spot. The 192nd Tank Battalion would aggressively seek out Japanese armor and engage at every opportunity. Preservation doctrine was finished. Word spread through the Bataan defensive positions within hours. American tanks could kill Japanese tanks. Easily. The fear that had governed every tactical decision for 3 weeks was built on an intelligence assessment that nobody had ever bothered to test in actual combat. The psychological reversal was immediate and measurable. American morale climbed. Japanese psychological advantage evaporated. But the engagement on January 9th was the beginning, not the end. What Morett had proven with 8 tanks on a jungle trail was about to be tested on a scale that would determine whether one man's decision to ignore doctrine and pull a trigger could actually change the outcome of a war. Because the Japanese 4th Tank Regiment was already moving toward Bataan, and they weren't sending 8 tanks this time. In Part 2, we'll see what happens when Morett faces 40 Japanese tanks at once, fighting wounded bleeding from 11 separate fragment wounds, directing fire, while his crew begged him to evacuate. And the 17-minute victory becomes a 2-hour battle that will define American armor doctrine for the entire Pacific War. 8 tanks, 18 minutes, 0 American losses. American. That was Part 1. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Morett ignored every order, pulled the trigger when doctrine said retreat, and proved in less time than it takes to eat breakfast that the most feared armor in the Pacific was a rolling coffin. The myth of Japanese tank superiority died in a jungle trail on Bataan on January 9, 1942. But destroying 8 tanks is one thing. Convincing an entire army to change how it fights is something else entirely. Because within 72 hours of Morett's ambush, the number that mattered most wasn't 8 destroyed Chihas. It was 40. 40 Japanese tanks from the 4th Tank Regiment already moving toward Bataan. And the commanders who had just watched Morett prove the doctrine wrong were about to demand he follow it anyway. This is where the story gets complicated. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Miller had seen the evidence with his own eyes. He had measured the Chiha's armor with a tape measure. 25mm. He had ordered the doctrine changed on the spot. What Miller could not change, what no battalion commander had the authority to change, was the thinking of the men above him in the chain of command. The after-action report from January 9th moved up the chain fast. By January 11th, it had reached Brigadier General Clyde Selleck, commanding the North Luzon Force's armor elements on Bataan. Selleck read the report. Then he summoned Miller to his command post. Miller brought Morett. Selleck sat behind a field table covered in maps. The kind of officer who had spent 20 years building a picture of how war worked and did not appreciate a staff sergeant redrawing it in 18 minutes. He looked at Morett the way senior officers look at junior enlisted men who have made them uncomfortable. "Your sergeant violated standing orders," Selleck said to Miller. "Preservation doctrine exists for a reason." Miller kept his voice level. "Sir, the after-action report demonstrates that preservation doctrine was based on incorrect intelligence. The Chiha's armor is 25 millimeters. Our gun penetrates 61. Your sergeant didn't know that when he engaged." "No, sir. He tested it." Selleck set down the report. "We have 40 enemy tanks moving toward our lines. If we commit our armor aggressively and lose it, we have nothing left. Nothing. Is that clear?" "Yeah." Morett stood at attention and said nothing because staff sergeants do not argue with brigadier generals, not directly, not out loud. But he looked at the maps on Selleck's table, and he saw the infantry positions marked in pencil along the Bataan defensive line, and he thought about every soldier in every one of those positions who was going to face a Japanese attack without armor support, because the generals had decided the tanks were too valuable to use. Then that was the enemy. Not the Chiha, not Japanese steel. The thinking that treated equipment as more valuable than the men the equipment existed to protect. Wait. Miller walked out of that meeting with conditional authorization to engage Japanese armor when conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. The definition of overwhelmingly favorable was left deliberately vague. It was the kind of order that meant yes and no simultaneously, that gave permission and withheld it in the same sentence that covered the man who wrote it, regardless of what happened next. Miller drove back toward the front. Morett rode beside him in silence for 2 miles. Then Miller said, "When they come, you engage. I'll handle Selleck." But here is what neither Miller nor Morett knew yet. There was a third man reading that after-action report. Captain Harold Johnson, 192nd Tank Battalion intelligence officer, 28 years old, had spent the previous 3 weeks doing the same math Morett had been doing and reaching the same conclusions. Johnson had been submitting revised intelligence assessments upward for 2 weeks, assessments that questioned the received wisdom on Chiha armor thickness, that pointed out the absence of any actual penetration testing in every briefing they had received. Yeah. Every assessment had come back marked noted. File for review. Johnson found Morett the morning of January 12th. He spread a set of photographs on the hood of a jeep. The photos were his own taken at the ambush site before the destroyed tanks were cleared. Close-up shots of penetration damage, entry holes, exit holes. The tape measure Miller had used still visible in one frame lying against the Chiha's front plate. "I've been trying to get someone to listen to this for 2 weeks, Johnson said. "What changed?" Morett asked. "You got 8 data points that are hard to argue with." Johnson had already drafted a formal request for a command-level armor capability reassessment. What he needed was a name attached to it that carried weight above his pay grade. Miller's name went on the document. So did Morett's. Johnson walked it up the chain himself, bypassing Selleck, entirely routing it through a supply officer with connections to General Edward King's headquarters staff. It landed on King's desk on January 13th. King summoned Selleck. Selleck summoned Miller. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. What came out of it was an order that nobody had expected, and that changed everything. A formal live-fire demonstration of Stuart versus Chiha armor, using a captured and intact Type 97 as the target to be conducted before the battalion's senior officers within 48 hours. One demonstration. Official. Witnessed. Documented. The results would determine doctrine for every armor unit on Bataan. If it failed, Morett's engagement would be written off as luck. Preservation doctrine would be reinstated. The tanks would go back into reserve. The infantry would keep dying. January 15th, 1942. 800 hours. A clearing 3 miles behind the main defensive line. The captured Cheeha sat at measured distances 100 yards, 300 yards, 600 yards. 3 marker stakes driven into the ground with range cards attached. 14 officers stood in a line 40 yards to the side, some with binoculars, most with folded arms and expressions that said they were there because they had been ordered to be there, not because they believed anything remarkable was about to happen. Selleck stood at the end of the line with his hands behind his back. Morett Stuart sat at the start position, Mitchell in the gunner's seat. The loader had the first round already chambered. The engine idled. The morning air smelled like jungle and diesel and the distant smoke from artillery exchanges 6 miles away, where infantry was fighting without armor support right now at this exact moment, while 14 officers watched a demonstration that would decide whether that ever changed. Miller gave the command, "Start at 600 yards." Mitchell put the crosshairs on the Cheeha's front plate and fired. The round crossed 600 yards and punched through the front armor. Straight through. Clean entry, clean exit. The captured tank rocked slightly from the impact. The 14 officers with folded arms unfolded them. 300 yards. Mitchell fired again. The round went through the front plate, through the interior and out the rear. 2 penetrations in 4 seconds. A junior officer behind Selleck said something quietly, and the man beside him nodded. 100 yards. Morett gave the fire command himself. At 100 yards, the 37mm round did not merely penetrate the Cheeha. It entered the front armor, and the energy transfer was so complete, so total, that the rear plate showed a bulge around the exit hole from the pressure wave that preceded the projectile through the fighting compartment. The captured tank visibly shifted on its tracks from the impact. Total elapsed time from first shot to third. 11 seconds, 3 rounds, 3 penetrations, front armor at 600, 300, and 100 yards. Selleck walked to the Cheeha himself. He put his hand against the entry hole on the front plate. He walked to the rear of the tank and looked at the exit hole. He measured neither. He didn't need to. His intelligence officer had already measured everything that could be measured and put the numbers in a report that Selleck had read 3 times. What the report hadn't given him was this: the physical reality. A tank his entire command had been afraid of for 3 weeks, with his hand inside the hole that an American gun had put through its armor from 600 yards away. He turned to Miller. "Revise the engagement doctrine," Selleck said. "Aggressive pursuit. Maximum utilization. Coordinate with infantry at every opportunity." He walked back to his jeep without another word. But the ratio shift that followed those 3 shots was not subtle. Before January 9th, the exchange rate between American and Japanese armor in the Philippines was 0. American tanks destroyed versus 0 Japanese tanks destroyed because nobody was fighting. After January 15th, the doctrine changed and the numbers changed with it. January 16th, Captain Donald Haynes Company B positioned 5 Stuarts on the same coastal road where American armor had retreated without firing on December 22nd. 12 Japanese Cheehas advancing in column. Haynes opened at 700 yards. 4 of the first 5 rounds achieved penetrating hits. The engagement lasted 28 minutes. 9 Japanese tanks destroyed. 3 abandoned by their crews. 0 American tanks lost. 2 Stuarts took direct hits from Japanese 57mm guns. Both shells failed to penetrate. The pattern from January 9th wasn't luck. It was physics, and physics worked every time. But the Japanese were watching, counting their losses, adjusting. By January 20th, intelligence reports indicated the 4th Tank Regiment was changing its approach routes, seeking terrain where American armor couldn't follow, attempting to bypass Stuart ambush positions by pushing through jungle that the heavier Cheeha was not designed to navigate. It was working occasionally. Japanese infantry were reaching American lines without armor support, which slowed them. But they were reaching the lines. And then on January 23rd, a captured Japanese officer provided information during interrogation that changed the tactical picture entirely. The 4th Tank Regiment was not the only Japanese armor unit in the Philippines. A 2nd regiment equipped with a tank that American intelligence had no accurate data on was being moved into position on Bataan's western coast. Different design, different gun, different armor specification. The interrogation report was thin on technical details. The captured officer was infantry, not armor. But what came through clearly was this Japanese command had seen what happened to the Chiha on Bataan, and they were not sending more Chihas. They were sending something else. And Benjamin Morett, who was about to climb back into his Stuart for the engagement that would nearly kill him, didn't yet know that the enemy had already begun building the answer to everything he had just proven. In Part 3, we follow Morett into the February 2nd assault, 40 Japanese tanks, pre-dawn darkness, and a rifle grenade that will put 11 fragment wounds in his face, jaw, and shoulder, and ask the question that nobody on Bataan was ready to answer. What happens when the new weapon the Japanese are bringing actually works? 8 tanks on January 9th, 9 more on January 16th. 0 American tanks lost in either engagement. That was the math coming out of Parts 1 and 2. Morett pulled the trigger when Doctrine said retreat proved the Chiha was a coffin with a gun, and watched General Selleck revise armor doctrine on the spot after 3 37mm rounds settled every argument in 11 seconds. The 192nd Tank Battalion stopped preserving tanks and started hunting with them. But the Japanese were counting their losses too. By January 20th, 1942, Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters in Manila had received 17 separate after-action reports from tank units on Bataan describing the same catastrophic pattern. American armor was not retreating. American guns were penetrating Chiha armor at ranges exceeding 600 yards. Japanese tank crews were dying inside vehicles they had been told were battle-proven killers. 17 reports. The same conclusion in every one. And the number that shocked Japanese commanders most wasn't the tanks destroyed. It was the exchange ratio. 17 Japanese tanks confirmed destroyed in 2 major engagements. 0 American tanks lost to Japanese tank fire. Not one. This is where the story stops being about one man's decision and starts being about what happens when an entire army's assumptions collapse at once. And Japanese intelligence officers on Luzon began emergency analysis of the Stuart's 37mm gun within days of the January 9th engagement. They had physical evidence, captured American technical manuals, recovered shell casings from the ambush site, photographs of Chiha penetration damage that their own engineers examined with the specific unhappy focus of men being asked to explain why their equipment had failed. The conclusion that came back from the engineers confirmed what the after-action reports already said. The Chiha's armor had been designed against infantry weapons. Against a high-velocity anti-tank gun, it offered protection that an engineer described in his report as insufficient at all practical combat ranges. Insufficient, the word that killed the myth. Japanese 4th Tank Regiment Commander Colonel Hifumi Amai convened an emergency briefing on January 18th. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The options on the table were limited, and none of them were good. Develop heavier armor in the field, impossible without industrial support. Avoid American armor, entirely tactically crippling. Overwhelm through mass attack, theoretically possible if you committed enough vehicles to accept catastrophic losses on the assumption that some percentage would survive to close with American positions. Whoa. Amai chose mass attack. He had 40 tanks operational. American intelligence estimated 18 Stuarts remained functional on Bataan. The math appeared favorable if you accepted that Japanese tanks would die at a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1 on the approach. Enough vehicles might reach American lines to matter. What the math didn't account for was Benjamin Morett. But here is where the situation on the American side was also deteriorating in ways that had nothing to do with Japanese tanks. By late January, the 192nd Tank Battalion was fighting a logistics problem that was arguably more dangerous than the Chiha. Bataan was a siege. No resupply ships were coming. Every 37mm round fired at a Japanese tank, was a round that could not be replaced. Every mechanical failure was permanent because there were no spare parts. Fuel was being rationed. 2 Stuarts had been taken out of service not from enemy action, but from engine failures that in any other theater would have been routine maintenance repairs. Morett's platoon was down from 3 operational tanks to 2. Quinn Stuart had thrown a track on January 21st during a repositioning move, and the repair required parts that existed in a depot in California and nowhere else on Bataan. The tank sat covered in camouflage netting, 300 yards behind the main line, waiting for parts that were never coming. Then, on January 24th, something happened that threatened to undermine everything the January engagements had built.
Bakitisiiti.
A Stuart from Company C, not from Morett's platoon, engaged what its commander reported as Japanese armor approaching through jungle terrain on the western approach to Bataan. The tank fired 7 rounds. No confirmed kills. The commander reported the rounds were deflecting off heavier armor. The report moved up the chain and hit every desk in the battalion within hours. Selleck read it and called Miller immediately. Miller drove to the Company C position and examined the ground. What he found was not a new Japanese tank with heavier armor. It was a Company C Stuart crew that had engaged a Japanese artillery tractor in low-light conditions, misidentified it as armor, and fired 7 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition at a vehicle that had no crew aboard because the Japanese had abandoned it 6 hours earlier. 7 rounds expended, 0 enemy casualties. 1 crew that had panicked and fired at a shadow. But the damage to confidence was real. For 48 hours, whispers moved through the battalion that the Japanese had brought up something new, something the Stuart couldn't handle. The fear that Morett had killed on January 9th was trying to come back through a side door fed by one misidentified target, and the anxiety of men who were running out of everything. Miller called a battalion briefing on January 26th. He stood in front of every tank commander the 192nd could pull back from the line simultaneously, and he put the Company C incident in plain language. No new Japanese armor. No deflected rounds. 1 crew, 1 mistake, 7 wasted rounds. Then he put the actual exchange ratio on a chalkboard. 18 Japanese tanks destroyed. 0 American tanks lost to enemy fire. He left the chalkboard up for the rest of the briefing. The whispers stopped. But the Japanese attack that Imai had been planning was already in motion. February 2nd, 1942, 0530 hours, Bataan Peninsula Western Sector. The Japanese 4th Tank Regiment launched its mass attack in pre-dawn darkness. 42, Type 97. Chi-Ha tanks moving in 3 columns with infantry following several hundred yards behind. The objective was breaking through the American defensive line before daylight exposed the columns to effective fire reaching Manila Bay and splitting the American-Filipino position in half. Imai's plan required speed and darkness. What it did not account for was that Morett's platoon had spent the previous night preparing exactly for this. Intelligence had indicated heavy Japanese armor movement for 36 hours. Morett had repositioned his 2 remaining Stuarts into hull-down positions, covering the most likely approach trail coordinated fields of fire, with 2 other platoons covering adjacent sectors, and pre-ranged the ground in front of his position using aiming stakes driven into the earth at measured intervals. 600 yards, 400 yards, 200 yards. Every stake a known distance. Every distance a calculated firing solution. At 5:45, the first Japanese tanks appeared as silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky. Morett counted 12 in the lead element, more behind them. He keyed his radio and reported to the other platoon's armor and company strength, moving on his sector all positions hold until his first shot. He held fire until the lead Chi-Ha crossed the 600-yard stake. Then he fired. The lead tank stopped burning before the second round was in the chamber. Mitchell loaded and traversed. Second tank, fire. The second Chi-Ha took a round through the turret at 550 yards and began shedding smoke immediately. Both other American platoons opened up simultaneously from their sectors. 6 Japanese tanks burning in the first 30 seconds. The Chiha column tried to deploy. Terrain stopped them. The jungle on both sides of the trail was too dense for the tanks to maneuver off the path, and the column was compressing as the lead tanks burned, and the following tanks had nowhere to go. Japanese commanders were making decisions in darkness with fires in front of them and 37mm rounds coming from positions they couldn't locate. Imai committed his second wave. 12 more tanks pushed forward, trying to drive through the kill zone on sheer momentum. This was the mass attack doctrine in practice: accept losses on the approach, close the distance, hope enough vehicles survive to matter. 8 of the 12 burned before they reached 400 yards. Morett Stuart was firing as fast as Mitchell could work the gun, and the loader could feed ammunition. The ready rack emptied. The loader moved to stored rounds. The gun barrel was heating from sustained fire and still operational. Morett stood in the commander's hatch maintaining situational awareness because he needed to see the whole field, not just what was visible through the vision blocks. And at 6:23, a Japanese infantry squad that had worked its way along the jungle edge reached a position close enough to engage with rifle grenades. The grenade hit the commander's cupola. The explosion caught Morett across the face and left shoulder. 11 fragments. He lost his grip. Blood ran down into his uniform. He could taste copper, and the ringing in his ears was absolute. His crew heard the explosion and came over the intercom, immediately hit how bad evacuate. Door. Morett keyed the intercom. "Oh, keep loading." He stayed in the hatch, blood on the vision blocks, one eye partially obscured by a gash above the brow. He directed targets by voice, calling out Chiha positions to Mitchell, coordinating with the other platoons on the radio, with his face covered in blood and the battle still fully in progress around him. 4th Chiha. Fire. 5th. Fire. The flanking Stuart caught a Japanese tank attempting to reverse at 600 yards through the rear armor. The weakest point, the Chiha that Imai had sent as the tip of his mass attack spear, burned like the rest. For 3 more hours, Morett directed fire from his wounded position. 11 fragment wounds: face, jaw, shoulder, upper back. None immediately fatal, all of them bleeding. The crew below him knew their commander was hit and kept loading anyway, because that was what he had told them to do, and because the alternative was stopping, and the battle wasn't stopped. By 9:30, the Japanese 4th Tank Regiment withdrew. The numbers on the ground told the story with the blunt arithmetic of actual combat. 18 M3 Stuarts against 42. Chihas. 27 Japanese tanks destroyed outright. 12 more abandoned by crews who climbed out of burning vehicles and ran, rather than stay in armor they knew couldn't protect them. Japanese infantry casualties were severe from tank fire once their armored support collapsed. American losses: 2 Stuarts damaged, both repairable. 0 tank crew killed. 0. The Japanese 4th Tank Regiment that had entered the battle as a cohesive fighting force never operated at full strength again. It had sent everything it had at American positions and received in return a kill ratio that Japanese armor doctrine had no framework to process. The mass attack, the option that Imai had chosen because the math appeared favorable, had failed completely because the math had been wrong about what American guns could do to Japanese armor. Morett was evacuated at 0945 when medics reached his position and saw the blood covering his uniform and equipment. The battalion surgeon counted the fragments and recommended 2 weeks minimum recovery. Morett said he would return when the fragments were out. The surgeon said 3 weeks. Morett returned on February 23rd. The Silver Star citation that followed described his actions in language that military citations use: controlled, formal, specific. Decision to engage when outnumbered. Continued fighting after being wounded. Destruction of enemy armor under sustained fire. The citation didn't capture the thing that actually mattered, which was that Benjamin Morett had spent 3 months on Bataan, proving that the most dangerous weapon in any battle isn't steel or firepower. It's the assumption nobody has tested. Yay. By late February, the broader lessons had moved beyond Bataan. The after-action reports from January and February 1942 were being read in Washington, in Australia, in every theater where American armor planners were making decisions about equipment and doctrine. The kill ratio. American tanks destroying Japanese armor at better than 10-to-1 was rewriting the assumptions that had governed Pacific armor planning since before the war began. Units preparing to enter the Pacific Theater received revised intelligence assessments. The Chiha was reclassified. Engagement doctrine was updated to reflect what Bataan had proved in blood and ammunition. The Japanese response at the strategic level confirmed the scale of what had happened. By mid-1942, Japanese armor doctrine in the Pacific had shifted away from offensive tank operations almost entirely. Chihas that had been intended as offensive breakthrough weapons were being dug into defensive positions and used as stationary gun emplacements. Japan was surrendering the one advantage that armor is designed to provide: mobility, because committing Chihas to mobile engagements against American Stuarts had produced losses that Japanese industrial capacity couldn't sustain. The tank that had rolled through China for 4 years, that had cut through Malaya in 3 weeks, that American soldiers had feared for 3 weeks on Bataan, was parked in a hole in the ground and told to stay there. That decision traced directly back to a jungle trail on January 9, 1942, and a staff sergeant who said 4 words into a radio. "We're going to find out." But Bataan fell in April 1942, and the man who had proven everything, who had changed doctrine and destroyed the myth and fought wounded for 3 hours, walked into Japanese captivity, along with thousands of other Americans and Filipinos. 3.5 years. The Bataan Death March. Prison camps. Conditions that the combat on that peninsula, as brutal as it was, had not prepared anyone for. What happened to Benjamin Morett after the guns stopped is a story that military history rarely tells. The part that comes after the victory. The part that isn't in the after-action reports. In Part 4, we follow Morett through captivity liberation and the quiet life he chose after the war, and ask the question that his story leaves open. When the man who proved that fear was the real enemy finally came home, what did he do with what he knew? From a jungle trail on Bataan to a revised doctrine that shaped the entire Pacific War, that is the journey across Parts 1 through 3. Morett ignored the order to retreat. Destroyed 8 Chihas in 18 minutes, survived a live fire demonstration that convinced a general to change everything, then fought wounded through 11 fragment wounds while directing the destruction of 27 Japanese tanks in the battle that broke the 4th Tank Regiment permanently. But here is the question that the after-action reports never answered. What happened to the man himself? Because the story of Benjamin Morett doesn't end with a silver star and a victory. It ends somewhere much quieter, much harder, and much more honest about what war actually costs the people who fight it. There is a twist at the end of this story that most history books skip entirely, and it reframes everything that came before it, because sometimes the price of being right is paid long after the battle is over. Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. General Edward King surrendered approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops to Japanese forces, the largest surrender in American military history. The tanks that hadn't been destroyed in combat were disabled by their crews before the surrender engines smashed, breeches destroyed, fuel burned. Morett watched his Stuart rendered inoperable with a sledgehammer, and then walked into captivity with the rest of the garrison. What followed was the Bataan Death March. 65 miles on foot in tropical heat, without adequate food or water, under guards who treated the column with a brutality that killed hundreds of men in the first 3 days alone. Morett survived the march. The historical record doesn't specify how, because Morett himself rarely spoke about it afterward, and the men who survived the death march generally divided into 2 categories: those who talked about it constantly because silence was impossible, and those who never spoke of it at all because speech was equally impossible. Morett was the second kind. He spent the next 3.5 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps on Luzon, primarily at Camp O'Donnell and later Cabanatuan. Conditions in both camps tested human endurance far beyond anything the fighting on Bataan had demanded. Malnutrition, tropical disease, dysentery, malaria, Cholera moved through the prisoner population in waves. American and Filipino prisoners died at rates that the International Red Cross would later characterize as among the highest of any POW population in the Second World War. Morett contracted malaria and survived it twice. He lost weight that his frame, already lean from 3 months of siege rations on Bataan, could not afford to lose. Fellow survivors who later provided testimony to military historians described a man who maintained a particular kind of discipline in captivity. Not the loud, defiant discipline of movies, but something quieter and more durable. He did what needed to be done. He helped men who were sicker than he was. He did not waste energy on expressions of rage that changed nothing. The same thorough patience that had made him a good tanker made him a survivor. Liberation came in early 1945 when American forces returned to the Philippines and began freeing prisoners from the camps. Morett was among the liberated. He weighed less than half his pre-war body weight. He carried malaria that would recur periodically for years. He had fragment wounds from February 2nd that had healed imperfectly in captivity without adequate surgical follow-up. And he carried something that had no entry in the medical records 3.5 years of a captivity that the human mind processes in ways that don't show up on any physical examination. He returned to Ohio in late 1945. He received his Silver Star. He accepted his discharge. He married a woman named Ruth in 1947, found work in manufacturing the world he had understood before the war, and began building the ordinary life that extraordinary circumstances had interrupted for 4 years. He did not lecture. He did not write a memoir. He did not seek speaking engagements or attend ceremonies beyond the occasional veterans' reunion, where the 192nd Tank Battalion survivors gathered in diminishing numbers as the decades passed. When his children asked about the war, he told them he had served in the Philippines and left it at that. The tank battles of January and February 1942, that military historians would later identify as the first significant American armor victories of the Pacific War, were not dinner-table conversation in the Morett household in Cleveland. But here is what the Silver Star citation said in the careful language that military commendations use when they are trying to compress something enormous into a paragraph. It cited his decision to engage enemy armor when outnumbered, and his continued fighting after being wounded. It did not say, because military citations don't say this kind of thing, that he was the man who ended a retreat, that had no tactical justification, proved an assumption that had been killing soldiers, and established through his own willingness to pull a trigger what no briefing or intelligence assessment had managed to establish in 3 weeks of doctrine and denial. But his real legacy wasn't the medal, it was the number that came after. The kill ratio that Morett established on January 9, 1942. American Stuarts destroying Japanese Chihas at overwhelming advantage held consistent throughout the entire Pacific War. Military historians, analyzing the complete Pacific Theater armor statistics, have calculated that American tanks destroyed more than 1,000 Japanese tanks during the war, while losing fewer than 50 American tanks to Japanese tank fire in direct armor versus armor combat. The ratio that emerged from that jungle trail on Bataan, better than 10 Japanese tanks destroyed for every American tank lost, proved not to be the product of one ambush, or one platoon, or one exceptional morning. It was the accurate reflection of a capabilities mismatch that existed from the beginning, and that a staff sergeant from Ohio had been the first person to test. The doctrine, revisions that followed Bataan influenced armor planning for every subsequent Pacific campaign. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima. At each of those battles, American armor units engaged Japanese tanks with the tactical confidence that comes from knowing your equipment. That confidence originated in specific documents. The 192nd Tank Battalion after-action reports from January and February 1942 that bore Morett's name and Mitchell's gun data, and the measured dimensions of Chiha armor that Miller had recorded with a tape measure from his map case while standing beside a burning Japanese tank in a Philippine jungle. The M3 Stuart itself was phased out as American armor design advanced, replaced by the M4 Sherman, then heavier designs optimized for the European theater against German armor that posed challenges completely different from the Chiha. But the 37mm gun that American planners had considered inadequate for modern warfare had been more than sufficient against the threat it actually faced. And the lesson embedded in that fact shaped how American armor doctrine evaluated equipment requirements for every subsequent conflict. The principle survived the tank that demonstrated it. Test your assumptions before your assumptions test you. Which brings us to the lesson that the technical history obscures. The institutional failure on Bataan before January 9th was not a failure of equipment. American tanks were superior to Japanese tanks from the first day of the campaign. The institutional failure was a failure of testing a willingness to accept a reputation as a substitute for verified information, to treat intelligence assessments built on incomplete data as settled fact, and to construct doctrine on the foundation of what people believed rather than what they had actually measured. This failure pattern is not unique to Bataan. Military history offers the same story in different uniforms across multiple centuries. At Agincourt, French cavalry commanders believed their armored knights were invulnerable to English longbowmen because they had never faced them in significant numbers before. At Chancellorsville Union, commanders believed the Confederate right flank was anchored and secure because the intelligence said so and nobody had ridden out to look. At Singapore in February 1942, the same month Morett was fighting wounded on Bataan, British commanders surrendered a garrison of 100,000 men to a Japanese force of 35,000, partly because the defensive assumptions built into Singapore's fortifications had never been stress-tested against the actual direction of attack. And in every case, the assumption was cheaper than the test, until the moment it wasn't. What Morett did on January 9th was not primarily a feat of arms. It was a feat of empiricism. He replaced a belief with a measurement. He substituted a reputation with a result. And he did it at personal risk in violation of standing orders, with no guarantee that his assessment of the gap between perception and reality was correct, because the only way to know if the 37mm could penetrate the Chiha was to fire the 37mm at the Chiha. You cannot calculate your way to that answer. You cannot brief your way to it. You have to pull the trigger. Now here is the detail that almost no account of Bataan includes, the piece of the story that sat in archives for decades before a military historian working on Pacific armor doctrine pulled it out and recognized what it meant. In December 1941, before the Philippines campaign began, before the first Japanese tanks rolled onto Luzon, American ordnance officers at Fort Knox had conducted penetration tests on armor plate samples of varying thickness using the 37mm M6 gun. The tests were routine part of ongoing weapons evaluation. The results showed penetration of 25mm armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The report was filed, classified as routine ordnance data, distributed through normal Army channels. It reached the Philippines Command in a supply shipment of technical documentation in late November 1941. It was logged into the quartermaster records, filed, and never read by a single armor officer before the Japanese invaded. The information that would have ended the retreat before it began, that would have told every Stuart commander in the Philippines that his gun could punch through a Chiha at ranges exceeding a mile, that would have made Morett's January 9th test unnecessary, because the answer was already known that information was sitting in a filing cabinet at Manila headquarters, while American tanks were withdrawing from Japanese armor without firing a shot. What Benjamin Morett discovered at 600 yards on a jungle trail at personal risk in violation of orders, with his gunner's hands on the traversing controls, and 8 enemy tanks coming down the road, the Army already knew, had known for weeks, and had filed the knowledge somewhere nobody could find it when it mattered most. The man who ended the retreat wasn't compensating for a gap in American knowledge. He was compensating for a gap in American attention. That detail is either darkly comic or profoundly instructive, depending on how you look at it. And it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close, because it changes the nature of what Morett actually accomplished. He didn't prove something that was unknown. He proved something that was known and ignored, which is in many ways a harder problem to solve and a more common one. From a manufacturing worker's son from Ohio with a gift for understanding machines and a 3-week combat record to the man whose 4-word radio transmission we're going to find out ended. A retreat broke a myth, changed doctrine, and established the kill ratio that would define American armor in the Pacific for the next 3 years. Benjamin Morett proved that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield is not the enemy's weapon, but your own army's unexamined assumptions. And because one 26-year-old staff sergeant was willing to test what everyone else had accepted, more than 1,000 Japanese tanks were destroyed against fewer than 50 American losses, a ratio written in the smoke of 8 burning Chihas, on the morning of January 9, 1942. If you know a story like this one, a forgotten name, a moment that changed everything, a test that nobody wanted to run, put it in the comments. History is full of Benjamin Moretts. Most of them are still in the filing cabinet. Subscribe, and we'll keep pulling them out. The real enemy was never the tank. It was the assumption that the tank was invincible, and the only weapon that ever defeats an assumption is the courage to test it.